this recorded webinar on green hydrogen. Very pleased to welcome James Patterson, who is VP for Green Hydrogen for BP. BP don't need any introduction, but James will be telling you about what they're doing.
Hi, Ivan. Thanks for having me.
Right, and just a few words about LGB for those who don't know us. We are a capital markets and investment firm. We spend a lot of time trying to help small companies grow and identifying small companies rather than helping BP to grow, which doesn't seem so necessary. And we've spent a lot of time looking at companies involved in decarbonisation on the energy transformation, so very much at the opposite end of the telescope to what James is looking at. James joined BP, I think, late last year as VP of Green Hydrogen, so he's in the gas and low carbon energy area, which was set up after BP's pivot to renewables 3 years ago. Part of his role is product owner for green hydrogen products globally. The bulk of his role, as I understand it, is for continental European projects in the Netherlands, Denmark and Spain. He's got a few slides to share with us to kick the presentation off. We will try to run this in a conversational mode, and we invite questions on the chat box. So, James, can I hand over to you for a moment?
Yeah, thanks, Ivan. That sounds good. And sorry, it's Germany, Netherlands, and Spain. We haven't included the Nordics yet in our strategy, but potentially.
I read DE as Denmark rather than Deutschland.
There you go.
Sorry.
No worries. No worries at all. So yeah, no, thanks for having me, and thanks for the introduction, and looking forward to the discussion. Joined BP in October last year in this kind of VP Green Hydrogen role, but with a Europe focus, as you pointed out, and was previously with NG in their green hydrogen focused business unit based in Paris before that. So, you know, it's a fascinating space. Happy to, I don't want to take too much time on my slides and in an introduction, because I want to delve into kind of topics that you're interested in talking to and might be more relevant to your viewers. But I think there's some important kind of concepts to get across to frame the hydrogen sector and opportunity. And I think, you know, hopefully by now people have heard of the different kind of colors of hydrogen out there. There are many colors in the rainbow. The two that we're most interested, or the only two that we're interested here at BP, is green hydrogen and blue hydrogen. And green hydrogen is the production of hydrogen with a machine called an electrolyzer powered by green energy, with a feedstock of water. And then blue hydrogen takes the very well-known and existing production of grey hydrogen, which is with a thing, can be with a variety of things, but mainly with a thing called a steam methane reformer, where you take a feedstock of natural gas, in other words, CH4, and you take the C away from, you split the C from the H, and you're left with hydrogen, but you're also left with a load of CO2. So that's kind of grey hydrogen. And then if you can capture that, then it changes color to blue, as it's a low carbon, zero or low carbon or low emissions type of hydrogen. So they're the two that we're interested in. People think of, when they hear hydrogen, they automatically think of things like perhaps cars, mobility, I suppose. They also might hear of kind of this, you know, long-term plan to replace natural gas with hydrogen in the energy mix. But to be honest, neither of those two things excite me much. The thing about hydrogen that excites me the most today and today I mean the projects that we can get started with is the replacement of grey with green and blue in industrial processes. Not many people understand or are aware that there's in fact 100 million, over 110 million tons of grey hydrogen produced annually in refining, in fertilizer production, and in other industrial feedstock like chemicals production and plastics production, etc. And so that's very much the first step from my perspective. And just to give you an idea, trying to share screen here. Let me try, there we go, that should work. Tell me if you can see my screen.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, so to give you an idea, this is the graph on the left is and these are internal BP kind of projections. So just bear that in mind. And what you have here in terms of the stack of colors is you have greenhouse gas emissions. Oh, sorry, actually, let me jump to this slide. So this shows that, and this is a bit misleading because it only says 66 million tons per annum. This is hydrogen in its pure use, but in total, in fact, this number is closer to 110 at the moment in terms of hydrogen as a feedstock. So as I said, into refining and fertilizer production. And what that means is that if you could convert that to, for example, I think it'll be a mix of green and blue, but let's just say for simplicity's sake that we replace all of that kind of grey hydrogen, that roughly 100 million tons of grey hydrogen, with green. That would take, if you're running the electrolyzer at 100%, which you wouldn't for various reasons, but even in the most optimal situation, you would still need roughly 600 gigawatts of renewable energy to run those electrolyzers. So I suppose my point is, even if hydrogen were not to emerge in all these other sectors, which we expect it to, and we think it will actually be required to do in order to reach kind of net zero targets by 2050, and those other categories, of course, are things like transport and heating and power itself, which we can talk about later. But even if that were not to kind of eventuate to the level we expect it to by 2050, there still is huge potential to decarbonize these existing grey hydrogen projects. So this is kind of what I've been focusing a lot of my time on to get started in this decarbonisation story. I mean, just quickly, I don't want to overwhelm you with graphs, but back to these ones. This shows the kind of greenhouse gas emissions by different sources. So you can see kind of industry at the bottom, transport towards the top, and the colors here represent, I suppose, a kind of what we call our new momentum scenario, which is a very mild kind of effort to reduce GHG emissions. If you want to get to net zero by 2050, then this is the line that it's going to have to follow. So you can see that there's a lot of work to do. There's a lot of greenhouse gas emissions to cut. So we're going to have to go to some pretty drastic measures to achieve that. You can also see here that this kind of projects final energy consumption here, and you can see that there's a lot of electrification that's going to happen to 2050, but there are things that simply cannot be electrified, and a lot of those are in industrial processes that require a huge amount of heat, industrial processes such as kind of steel and cement production. These will require something, another solution. And while hydrogen is an expensive solution at the moment, and particularly in things like steel, it is quite economic today. We simply, in my view, have no other choice, and therefore we will kind of find a way to make it work. So that's kind of what I wanted to kind of frame, that this shows that there's a lot of hydrogen projects going on globally. I mean, I wouldn't put too much, it's a bit of an indication of where the industry is going in terms of region. I would put projects in inverted commas. A lot of these are announcements, I suppose, that are waiting for certain pieces to come into place. Some projects are obviously more real than others, but it gives you a bit of a feel on where the projects are. And for me, there's two types of regions, right? Demand centers, like Germany and industrial areas like Germany's and the Netherlands of the world, where actually it's probably not the best and cheapest place to produce green hydrogen, for example, given the cost of renewable electricity. And then there's the supply hubs, places like Australia, where they haven't got much industry to go into, but they're going to be the cheap places to produce the stuff. And then there's places like the US that have both, right? But for the most part, you're either a supply hub or a demand center. BP's strategy is very much to get going in the demand centers like Germany and Netherlands, where there is the subsidies to get started. And that there is the demand from customers there, but we do expect that at one point it will switch over to be more economic and therefore more cheaper, basically, to import that hydrogen from a low cost supply hubs. But who knows when that will be? So we need to kind of position ourselves in both of those places. And then before I hand over to Ivan to give a bit more direction towards what you'd like to talk about, I suppose this gives a bit of a kind of background on the different elements that we need to consider in the supply chain. So if you focus first on green, you have many different renewable power options. The top three obviously being solar, wind, and hydro, and then you have low carbon options like nuclear as well. Of course, I'm not sure why that's on. Nuclear is on there, given green H2 is not nuclear. Then you have your electrolyzer, which we can spend some time on talking about the different technologies there. But then in between the electrolyzer and the customer, there's a lot to do, right? For example, you're going to need to potentially store at large scale. You're going to need to build a repurposed pipeline to get it to your customers, and probably a combination of pipeline and trucking. Before you put it in the truck or even in the pipeline, you're going to have to compress it before you put it in the pipeline. You're probably going to have to liquefy it before you put it in the truck. And there are different carriers and ways you would consider before you put it on a ship. And then downstream, in terms of the uses, I just talked before about the existing segment, which is the replacement of grey H2 with green, green or blue in an industrial feedstock setting at the top. But then, of course, we have transportation, we have heating in homes, we have new industrial heat processes, we have power generation, which I think is going to take quite a long time to achieve. There's lots of different end uses to discuss. So that's a bit of a introduction on the kind of things I've been thinking about, but happy to hand over to Ivan to maybe give some direction on some of the topics you'd like to address.
That's great, James. Thank you very much. I guess, given the scale of change, there are going to be some massive bottlenecks in technologies and the supply chain. One of the bottlenecks, I guess, is electrolyzers, and electrolyzers have been around for a long time. But one of the problems with electrolyzers is they don't always last for a long time. So perhaps you mentioned there are different technologies. There are some emerging technologies. What's your sense of how that's going? And is it a concern as a sort of infrastructure provider that you're potentially investing in things that just aren't going to last that long?
I've never been too concerned about the electrolyzer not lasting too long. As you said, it's a very well-established technology. It's been used in chloralkaline production for 100 years. This is and it's been used for hydrogen production at smaller scale. The missing piece is here is we haven't done it at industrial scale much. I suppose globally, there's one exception I can think of, a project we worked on in Peru at NG, where there was a 26 megawatt electrolyzer that had been producing green hydrogen for the last 40 odd years. And there needs to be capex invested at certain points in the life cycle. You need to replace your electrolyzer stack at some point, and when you do that, is very much a question of modeling the efficiency, right? There is a degradation in electrolyzers, so in other words, you do need to put more power in for the same output, which can be which happens over time. I think it's roughly speaking a percentage point a year, and it's a percentage point or two per year,
which isn't too bad, really.
Yeah, which isn't too bad, but at some point you're gonna weigh up the cost benefit analysis from an economic point of view of spending an extra few million on replacing the stack. Electrolyzers are today and will become much more relatively cheap if you put it in the context of the cost of the overall project. People don't realize that electro is actually a relatively small part of it. There's balance of plant, and there's the construction costs, and if you look at the capex of a project, I don't know, like it's not going to be as much as you think in terms of percentage towards the electrolyzer itself. So the spend on that incremental spend in 10, 15, 20 years to replace your stack and reset your efficiency is not a huge thing. I think that the two front runners in terms of technologies here are alkaline and PEM, and both have their kind of disadvantages and advantages that you need to weigh up in each situation. You need to get. It's key to get experience in how to run these things. We're learning this from kind of some small scale stuff that we're putting in operation, but also our partners. We've got a partner called ICC, which is a recently formed joint venture with Nobian, a spin-off from AkzoNobel, and they're the guys they're a good example of the guys who've been running this stuff, running these electrolyzers for a long time for chloralkaline production. And it is a matter of understanding your electrolyzers as they age, which ones to run the hardest, which ones to run less hard, depending on how they do fare over time, and then again when to replace them. But I wouldn't say that's a concern. I think the technology itself is quite dependable, quite well tried. I think the bigger issues you have when you're thinking about technology and is your technology going to fail or need some work where you're going to have some downtime. I'm more concerned about the kind of compression element and obviously the storage element if you need it. I'm a lot less concerned about the electrolyzer itself.
In what sense on the compression and
compression?
storage?
I mean, we're very experienced with compression here at B.
Yeah, well, I mean, the LNG relies on it, doesn't it?
Exactly, and grey hydrogen. Like we have huge amounts of grey. We've been handling hydrogen at relatively large scales within our refinery as a feedstock for 100 years. So, but through that experience, it's clear that one of the most difficult things you need to deal with is compression, because it requires a lot of seals, a lot of moving parts. It requires a lot of maintenance, and therefore to do this at a huge scale I would say that the thing that's the natural issues that come with compression are an example of something that you would really need to be on top of to prevent significant unexpected or significant downtime in your operation. I mean, storage, I think, is an example of something that is untested at scale and is quite expensive. Realistically, it's going to have to be things like salt caverns that are going to need to be used to if we're going to store this hydrogen at scale. And this is all, again, stuff that is new. This is all kind of untested. So obviously salt caverns are used for multiple other purposes, but in terms of storage, but they haven't yet been used at scale for hydrogen. So this is all things we're going to have to learn.
I suppose that brings us on to something which is suggested as an easier way of transporting it, which is as ammonia.
Yeah, exactly. So, the transportation over long distances, when you're shipping the stuff, this is a question everyone's asking, and there's no clear answer. There are different alternatives. There's ammonia, there's liquefied hydrogen, or there's LOHCs. And
LOHCs for the uninitiated.
I shouldn't have said it without actually knowing what it stands for. Liquid organic hydrogen carriers. These, don't ask me yet the chemistry behind it, but basically you have a liquid organic matter that you can hydrogenate. That's it, and dehydrogenate at the other end. And it's kind of it's similar to what you're doing with ammonia, but you produce the ammonia with your Haber-Bosch at one end, and then you're going to have to crack the ammonia out of the it's called crack the ammonia out of the ammonia at the other end. And they're the kind of so those two and liquefied hydrogen are the three that are being analyzed, right? And there's there's different pluses and minuses to both. They're largely untested. For example, while ammonia production is obviously through the fertilizer industry, something that's done already at scale and shipped around the world, cracking it back to hydrogen is a different story. This is a technology which doesn't exist yet, and
so presumably just using the stuff as directly to power engines, which is what's being talked about certainly for marine engines. Why crack it back when you can use it straight
exactly
off?
So I mean, this is why ammonia gets the most kind of airtime, and this is why, frankly, it's my favorite, because even if it were to be found to be the more expensive hydrogen, and yet to be seen if it is, but even if, let's say, in the worst case scenario, were found to be the more expensive hydrogen carrier, if you wanted pure hydrogen, then you still have kind of all these other uses in the form of ammonia fertilizer to begin with, right? So green fertilizer is something which will come under demand, and then green ammonia for shipping fuel, green ammonia for industrial purposes, for heating purposes. You'll at least have all of these other uses, and I think that flexibility to ship it somewhere and then be able to kind of either crack it back to hydrogen if it's hydrogen that you need, or use it as ammonia is going to be really valuable. And obviously the other thing that's valuable is that it's already happening. Ammonia is already being shipped around the world at relatively large scale. So it seems the natural kind of carrier or natural carrier that will get going first, I suppose.
Because I'm just thinking about the sort of potential infrastructure costs for all this. I mean, if you just think about transport, which I know you said is sort of relatively down the stage, you're looking at not just petrol stations where you have the choice of petrol and diesel, but electric charging, but also potentially hydrogen as well. I mean, this is an awful lot of spending. This is new transport systems,
Definitely.
And at least ammonia is potentially you can summon up a truckload of ammonia or a tanker load of ammonia today if you wanted.
Mm.
Um,
Yeah.
But,
Yeah. I mean, to give you an order of magnitude, kind of, if you do a rough back of the envelope based on stuff that's untested, right? So it's all kind of, some of this is desktop study on how much it costs from the flange of the electrolyzer in a supply hub to get it to your end customer in a place like, say, Germany, in an industrial region. And at the moment, you're probably looking at something like $2.50 a kilogram across, that you've got to add on then to the price. So then, even if you are producing it at that kind of magic number, which everyone's aiming for, which is $2 a kilogram in that supply hub, you've then got to add another. You've got to double the price, basically more than double the price, before you've actually got it to your end user. So what this converts to, in my mind, my gut feeling is that local production, even in places that have potentially poor renewables, not enough space and not enough sun and not enough wind, places like Germany and the Netherlands, local production will probably prevail for a lot longer than people think, supported by subsidies, until that economic import story arrives. And for that to arrive, I think there's going to have to be some technological advances that bring that cost down.
So, I mean, this sort of question of efficiency brings, I suppose, us on to the whole question of the sort of, the energy return on investments. That, as things stand, traditional energy, including nuclear, hydrocarbon, is, I mean, I've seen it quoted as an order of magnitude, so plus or minus 10 times as efficient as photovoltaic and wind. That there's an awful lot of more energy is going to be required to make this transition at some stage.
True. There's no denying.
And that presumably implies massive investment in solar and wind power, which I guess is one of the things BP is getting increasingly involved in.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think for obvious reasons, not just because of hydrogen, but for obvious reasons, BP, as you mentioned, had that kind of pivot towards renewables. We are, through our JV partner Lightsource BP on the solar, very active on the solar side, and then directly with offshore wind in places like Europe and the UK, and then onshore wind in places like the US. We're more and more active, and there's investment going into building that business. It's been relaxed for now, but the subsidies from governments will eventually become conditional on a thing called additionality. In other words, you will need to have access to the subsidies. You will need to be using incrementally new renewable assets.
Yeah, because otherwise the danger is you simply crowd out the supply into the grid.
Exactly. You very much want kind of hydrogen projects to be an enabler of to be forcing new renewables projects to be built. I mean, this will obviously be necessary in places, in supply hubs where we're building. You want to kind of produce gigawatts of huge amounts of hydrogen, and it'll need to be powered by gigawatts of new renewables in places like Australia and the Middle East and potentially North Africa, but in demand centers where we need to get going now before those supply hubs arrive. This is the challenge, and originally this additionality criteria was quite restricted, because what it meant was that the only players out there that could do these projects who would be eligible for the subsidies would be the big established renewables companies, and that kind of made it a bit hard for the likes of BP, because while we're moving fast, we're not quite there yet, and we hope to be in a few years a really kind of big and competitive player in a lot of these areas, but we're not there yet. So I was quite happy for the restrictions to be relaxed until the end of 2026. But once the 1st of January 2027 rolls around in Europe, to have access to some of these subsidies, it will need to be renewable assets that were built within 1 or 2 years of the electrolyzer coming online.
So if you think about these big projects, I mean, I've looked at a couple of early stage projects, and part of the problem is once you get to the sort of final investment decision, then there's any number of big infrastructure funders who will project finance stuff. But getting the projects there, you look at some of, for example, tidal energy projects, there's a lot of money needs spending on planning and
definitely the development costs
stuff.
are huge. Yeah.
Development costs are huge. I mean, you need therefore deep pockets to do that. Is that the sort of thing that companies, BP and similar companies, are going to get involved in?
By getting involved in it, are we willing to put the level of development expense?
Yeah, or is that just not is that more of a venture proposition?
No, that's our business model.
Yeah.
That's exactly our business model. We're developing these projects from a concept all the way to FID. So that means a lot of time, effort, and money. The development expense for this stuff compared to a mature project is really big. Still very small compared to the amount of capex you need when you're actually building the thing.
Sure. But there's no shortage of people who provide it once you got to FID, really.
Correct. And what you'll find more and more is that, what I'm finding more and more is that the infrastructure funds have got a lot of money, as they always do, to deploy. And so if they're seeing this hydrogen opportunity in the future, and they're not necessarily waiting until it gets to that point that there's a multi-billion-dollar project that they can enter into at FID or COD. There, more and more infrastructure players realize that they have to be involved in and sharing that early development expenditure, actually, so that they can have a foot in the door and learn. And as I understand it, it's hard for an infrastructure fund that's backed by pension money to simply just jump into something big and new without educating their investors, without having been in it for a while, even if it is for a few smaller, less economic projects to begin with. There is an education process there, and so
there is an opportunity for companies like BP to do that. To what extent do you have to worry about the sort of wider environmental consequences? I mean, batteries are obviously, there are big questions around lithium in terms of environmental and ethical sources of them, water use, the sort of, if you like, the knock-on effects, or is that not really a problem?
So environmental is really important, and let me touch on a few things in no particular order. The sheer, and this is more with the renewables required, to the huge scale of renewables required to power some of these supply hub projects, is actually, it's a huge amount of land use. And even on small projects in Australia, you run into, in places like Australia, and I'm sure everywhere in the world, you quite rightly run into issues where you've got a local endangered species like a snake or a frog or something that you're going to pretty seriously displace as a result of bunging down 5 gigawatts of solar across a huge amount of land. So there's a lot of there's a lot of work to be done around the kind of permitting and the environmental footprint of that level of land use. Then with the hydrogen itself, with the electrolyzer itself, I don't think it's a huge issue. I think it's less of an environmental issue. It's more of the PEM technology, for example, uses precious metals, and we expect them to become more and more scarce, and therefore PEM could actually become more and more expensive at some point. But that's not an environmental issue. And then there are environmental issues being discussed at the moment, without wanting to put things on people's radar that aren't on people's radar. But there's been an article going around the moment about the impact of releasing pure hydrogen into the atmosphere if there was some kind of large leak of hydrogen, and the effect that can have on other gases and chemicals in the atmosphere, and there's some view that would have a huge adverse effect. This needs to be kind of investigated. So there are, of course, lots of issues to think through with something new like this.
I mean, so final question for me, I guess, is that if this is, to the extent that this is about global warming, to the extent that we are getting involved in very large scale capture of solar energy and reusing, as opposed to it being radiated back from the Sahara Desert or whatever, straight back into space, that there isn't a something for nothing here. Is there not a danger that we just end up with warming in a different way? Or is that too far down the line?
By warming in a different way, you mean if we don't?
Well, if the energy is captured rather than radiated back, and this is for large scale solar, then you're still warming. You're still warming the planet. Yeah, I'll leave it. I'll park that one with you, James. Yeah. Right. I think at that point we probably ought to open for questions. I had a few questions beforehand. We've talked a little about the energy return on investments, and I think your answer really is, yeah, there is a big gap, and it's going to come down with technology.
Let me just open the Q&A. Hold on.
Yeah.
Okay, so which question you're on? The first one at the bottom, shall we start with?
Yeah.
Sure, the one starting with surely.
Okay, surely. I'll see if I can find the.
Okay, so let me read the question out loud. So surely the main application for hydrogen is to store the renewable energy when there is no wind and sun, because it is much cheaper than using lithium-ion batteries. And this can be incentivized by insisting on energy storage for any new energy modality. Yes, is the answer. What I was talking about before is kind of what I am focusing on now, because it's the opportunity of today. But once electrolyzers come down in price as a result of mass production and automation, and once renewables come further down in price, and there's particularly significant room for that in technologies such as solar, then I am a believer that this will be, one of the most important kind of reasons or uses for hydrogen. At NG we used to call it bottling the sun. So it in theory it is a way of solving the intermittency issue of renewable energy, because it's not like you can and the fact that the sun doesn't shine and the wind doesn't blow really well in every location in the world. So in theory there's this kind of very beautiful solution where places like Australia, the solar panels of the world capturing the sun, producing hydrogen, and then hydrogen is put on a ship, either as we were discussing, via a carrier such as ammonia or liquefied or whatever, to places like Asia or Japan perhaps, where there's less room for renewable power, and then it's fed into either kind of the equivalent of CCGTs, so kind of turbines running that are burning hydrogen instead of natural gas and producing electricity, or into fuel cells, either for electricity generation or with applications such as cars. So this is definitely the beautiful picture you could paint of the future, where we're all kind of running on renewables, and this is the only way to store it, because you're not going to power a massive battery and then put a battery on a ship and send it to Japan, and you're not going to build that much of transmission lines under the ocean. It's just not. It's much less economic. So yes, but my point is that kind of future is one that's in terms of power generation from hydrogen is one that's a lot further away So I'm focusing my efforts today on projects that we can do today, which are these industrial feedstock projects.
Cool, thanks. There was a question about the dangers of ammonia, and I guess the answer to that is that it's something you're that there's an established supply chain and ability to handle. And the other question, of course, is the question about the dangers of hydrogen.
Yeah, no, ammonia. It's certainly something that's getting a lot of attention in the press, and something that's at the top of our list to try to solve. I think it's solvable. Yes, ammonia is pretty toxic. So yes, it is kind of shipped around the world today in the form of fertilizer, but what we're talking about here is a much larger scale. So therefore, you have to worry more about the things like toxicity. I think we can solve this problem. As you mentioned, Ivan, this is something we do today. Therefore, sure, we need to do it we're going to need to do it a lot better if we're going to be doing it 100 or 1,000 times larger scale than we're currently doing. But I'm confident that we can solve that problem. But it certainly is something when you're weighing up the different carriers with the pros and cons column, it certainly is something that's squarely in the cons column of ammonia when comparing it to the other options you have. So certainly something that hasn't been solved but needs to be.
Dangers of hydrogen.
Yeah,
I think
the next one is the hydrogen.
Yeah, the dangers of hydrogen, I guess, which I was.
Yeah, so I mean, yeah, you mean in terms of it being kind of flammable and explosive, and yeah, exactly. So, I see a future where, again, like there's I see if hydrogen is in industrial feedstock purposes is something that, as I said, has been done for 100 years, and we have experience in. It's when it starts becoming, heating your home, I suppose, and fueling your cars, and that's where I think the additional care needs to be taken, for sure. As I said, I'm more excited about hydrogen in industrial at the moment, in industrial kind of settings, and so but I do. There is, it does burn. It does burn. When it burns, it's invisible. It is highly flammable. So there needs to be more care taken when there is hydrogen in built-up areas. That's for sure. And it is a big concern of mine that if we're rushing to get these hydrogen out there, that people will rush and maybe not follow the safety parameters as well as they should, and there could be some explosions and some deaths, and really set the industry back. So this is certainly a concern of mine. But it's more of an optical concern for me. Like any industry, there will be setbacks, but I feel like technology will play its part in making this a safe product, and making sure that the potential downside is far outweighed by the upside.
Okay. I guess, with your focus on Europe, is Europe going to end up as the question that you can see in the box, dependent on sort of resource-intensive countries, that we go back to the situation we are with hydrocarbon?
It's a really good question, and something
it may be unavoidable.
Yeah, and it's something we're thinking about when we're getting a lot of options. We're making a lot of we're making sure we have a lot of options and a lot of different kind of supply hubs, because there are many different factors that are gonna weigh into the fact on who are the winners, and this is one of them. Again, because of this region, because of this energy independence priority at the moment, I am more and more a believer that local production, even if it's more expensive, and will play an important part. But eventually, it's unavoidable that the supply hub importation will be cheaper. But then, do you want to be dependent on some places in the Middle East, for example? Do you want to be dependent on China, or do you want to be, these are the questions you need to ask. But I think my sense is there are going to be enough strong supply hub options here that you will be able, you'll have enough choices. There'll be enough choices that if you don't want to be dependent on a specific part of the world, then you're not forced into doing so.
A question about coming back to electrolyzers. You've already said that that PEM, the worry is that the platinum group metals are going to become more expensive. And Peter Dobson's asked, given the Chinese are going for alkaline electrolyzers, is there a good reason, except for just historic technology, that European companies have tended to work with PEM electrolyzers?
Yeah, again, it's yet to be seen. I mean, I think that there's some advantages with PEM, and until we kind of are running these things at scale, I'm kind of take some of this with a grain of salt. But from what I've heard, PEM, you should be able to run more on a more intermittent basis for longer with less degradation over time. That running it intermittently is one of the things. Turning it off and on all the time is one of the things which can cause faster degradation in the efficiency of your electrolyzer, and so you need to weigh that up. And PEM is supposed to be marginally better in that regard. PEM is also better when you've got limited space. You can fit more PEM into a smaller piece of area than you can with alkaline. So there are situations where clearly PEM is preferable to alkaline for those reasons. But I'm kind of with you a bit on. I mean, I'm a bit worried about the with the precious metal or rare metal uses of PEM, and you can see the trouble that Elon Musk is running into already with his with what he needs for his batteries. If we start producing electrolyzers at the scale that we're projecting, then this could become a big issue. So personally, and this is, I'm not in a good enough position because I'm not on the kind of innovation and engineering and technology team. My gut feeling is that alkaline at scale is probably the way to go, but I think it's a complex problem and better left to the experts.
And presumably, potentially, you can deal with that with the old baseload problem. You have one for baseload, one for intermittency. But yeah, okay.
Yeah, exactly. But I mean, when you say baseload, I mean, how are you going to achieve?
If there is a baseload.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, there are areas where there's a sun, wind, and hydro combination, particularly in places like Spain, where you can get your kind of electricity, clean electricity supply up towards 100, which is great. But actually, a lot of the long-term modeling shows that because of the fall in the price of electrolyzer and the expected fall in solar, that it actually might make sense to, oversize your solar, oversize your electrolyzer to an extent, and increase your kind of load factor or whatever in that way, but not achieve the 100% that you need. So then it becomes, okay, if an industrial process or a Haber Bosch with ammonia needs a base load supply, then maybe storing an intermittent hydrogen supply and then creating that base load through storage is the best solution. The optimization of these systems, of these production facilities, is very complex and very dependent on the local parameters and your expectations on the falling in price of the different pieces of the puzzle over time.
Do BP or companies like BP, the other big energy companies, actually, are they looking at making investments in the technology providers, or is it easier just to stay away? And what we have seen,
Yes,
for example, with the fuel cell companies, is that a lot of them now have significant investments from companies like Robert Bosch or ABB, who are looking at ways of securing their position. So ABB, for example, in order to do power sources for data centers. But I mean, historically, that hasn't been something that BP have done particularly. I mean, in oil services tended to be sort of very much arm's length.
Yeah, I think the answer is yes. Obviously we have things like our venture capital arm who are going to invest in early stage stuff to try to enable and get things going, but also at the larger scale, I think there is a willingness for BP to invest in technology providers where it makes sense to speed up the enabling of this market. And ammonia is a good example. I think we produced ammonia in the past and would stop for a while, but we're very keen to in the context of green ammonia and hydrogen, we're very interested in getting back into that, and we'll definitely need partners, I think, to do that.
So the question's been asked, if you're a private investor, where would you be looking? But I guess I can flip it around and say, if you were running the VC department, what sort of companies would you be looking at?
Well,
fuel cell companies, electrolyzers, storage companies. I mean, just generically.
You have to be careful, right? Because from an equity perspective, the industry is overhyped. So there's going to be kind of I'm a firm believer, obviously, that this is only going in the medium and long term in one direction, which is up. But there'll be mini corrections on the way, right? And therefore, I think you need to be careful with things like electrolyzer companies that are potentially overinvested and have benefited to this day from that hype. But there could be some kind of corrections on the near-term horizon as people realize, for example, that slide I showed you, that of those 200 and whatever projects that have been announced, only a fraction of those are actually going to come to fruition. So I would be focusing, and I've seen other private equity players, for example, that I'm close to. I would be focusing on what's the next most important thing in the balance of plant. Like compression is a good example of something that perhaps is underinvested and will become more important. The provider of the technology for compression at scale, for storage at scale. What's the next cab off the rank in terms of the technology that we provide will be needed for these large scale projects. Cracking could be interesting eventually, probably not yet. But yeah, I think I would be cautious in investing in the front and the guys that have been in the front and center of the hype for a while now. And that would be the electrolyzer companies. I would be looking for, in the same way that, people who are smart enough to buy in silver when gold was overhyped because it was the next thing to boom. I would think of a similar approach here.
Right. Okay. Well, I think we've pretty much got to the end. There was a question as to whether those slides were available, which we can come back to you on later, or whether they're just internal.
Yeah, let me check with my internal people. I think it's possible. I put them together late last night, and I need to double check if some of the projections are public. So.
James, that was really extremely interesting, and we could have gone on for great deal longer, but very, very much appreciate you making the time. And I'm sure we haven't answered all the questions entirely to the satisfaction of those who asked them, but we'll try and get back to people who've asked with a bit more detail.
My pleasure, Ivan.
Yeah, that's so thank you very much. And yeah, I've felt for some while, and this absolutely confirms it, that rather than the Greta Thunberg, that you guys are the enemy, that, you know, if there's going to be a solution to this, it has to come from the existing major energy companies.
Yeah, I mean, it's true, Ivan. Look, from my experience, the winners here are going to be the companies that kind of have the willingness to throw resources and money at this and take risks, because unless you do that, you won't be able to make that all important kind of first moving step. And from my view of being here, albeit only 9 months, BP certainly a company at the forefront of this movement and trying to make it happen. So.
Brilliant. Thank you very much.
Thanks,
Thank you,
guys.
everybody.
Cheers. Thanks, Ivan. Have a good one.